So, this is the beginning of our 100th episode on the Decarb Connect podcast. And I have invited another member of the team to join me, Jack Figg, who heads up our membership activity on the Decarbonisation Leaders Network, to interrogate me about the podcast and all things decarb.
Hello everybody, and hello Alex. Congratulations for hitting the 100 mark. A lot has happened in that time between episode 1 and episode 100, both for Decarb Connect, but also in the world of decarbonisation. With that in mind, I wanted to ask you a few questions and, like you said, interrogate you, but I promise I will be kind. So the first question is just, over 100 episodes, what stands out for you and what are we learning about what people want?
When we started recording these, it was summer 2020. And although many legislative deadlines were already in place, there wasn't a whole lot in industry. There were very few companies really then that had set targets or plans. So I suppose my main observation about what's changed is just that in those early times, the conversations were much more about what could be routes forward and what might work for people. And there are definitely still companies that are still at that stage who are watching and waiting to see what works for others. But increasingly, and particularly, I think in the last year, 15 months, conversations have been a lot more about what is happening, what technologies do exist. And it's more about how do we scale, and a lot more of the conversations talk about how we scale what's needed. I think there's a sense that one size does not fit all. And so, whilst if you read the newspapers or trade press, you'd be forgiven for thinking that it was a battle between hydrogen and CCS, the truth is what we see, and again, what we hear on the podcast over the last 18 months in particular, is different tools, different strategies are going to be needed for different sites. So that's also interesting. It's just kind of like a maturing of the conversation, I think.
I do think it would be interesting when we hit that 200 mark as well to see how things have changed, if at all, if we're still kind of having that same conversation and maybe looking back on the what has happened rather than what is happening. My next question is again about the podcast and kind of your expectations. So just around launching the podcast, what were your initial expectations of where it would go and how it would develop?
I had no idea, really. The launch of the podcast happened because actually our sponsor, Jano Media, came to me and suggested it. That first year that Decarb Connect launched was 2020, and as everyone will remember, we were all in lockdown, and so plans were up in the air about how we would get people together and how we would convene any meetings. And it was Jano that suggested a podcast might be a way to just start building some kind of sense of community, start sharing stories of what really was happening, give people a glimpse, especially I think because so many of us were locked down at that time, a glimpse into pockets of activity in very different places. So honestly, I think I thought we would probably do 6 episodes and that would be it. I hear about the podcast all the time from people. Recent event in Canada, I had someone take me to task for why we'd had this long pause, and it's fascinating to me. It's really grabbed people's attention, and it has been really interesting for me, a great way to take regular pauses in our day-to-day work just to talk to someone for half an hour about their view on what's happening. That again, it's beaten my expectations about what I might take from that. So yes, I suppose I didn't really know where it would go. I wouldn't have predicted we'd still be going at 100 episodes. I love it, and I, hope we'll continue, because I think just having these informal chats with people about where they're at and what they're focused on, I think gives people inspiration, but also maybe information and ideas they can pursue.
Yeah, certainly, it was definitely the correct decision to take that leap into the podcast realm. So yeah, and now here we are at episode 100. Another question, actually, which is a little bit more personal to yourself as a podcast host. It's quite interesting to understand who you're listening to. What other podcasts are out there that tickles your fancy?
So I regularly listen to My Climate Journey. I think that's a really interesting podcast that looks a lot at disruptive technology. I dip in and out of Energy Gang, and I dip in and out of Outrage and Optimism as well. And then otherwise, honestly, the podcasts I mostly listen to, because I'm an entrepreneur who started a small business, I listen to quite a lot more podcasts that are more about how one goes about building a business. But yeah, the climate ones, Outrage and Optimism is good as I say, dip in and out of that. But My Climate Journey, I would recommend to anybody.
Yeah, well, I would definitely just recommend the Decarb Connect podcast. But Yeah, I guess this is looking into the future again, and maybe a bit more on topic about Decarb Connect and decarbonisation. But do you have a sense of what the conversations might start sounding like moving forward as the decarb landscape changes?
Good question. I think we need to start covering more about the financing, the funding of these major projects, whether it's site-based projects or infrastructure. There's always talk about the amount of capital that's out there waiting to apply itself to big challenges. But as anyone in this space knows, it's also still relatively challenging to find the right partners to fund specific projects. So I think we need to talk about that more and help create some sort of practical steps forward there. And then I think also there'll be more about the rollout of at-scale technology. So as people who listen regularly will know, we talk quite often to disruptive tech, often companies that have a pilot, maybe one or two pilots, but the reality is we need to see some quick scale up and then roll out, and that will present its own problems as the supply chain for a lot of technologies relies on the same sort of minerals or gases or the same materials, and there'll be a lot of competition in the supply chain as a result. So I think that'll be what we hear a bit more of.
Thank you. Your interrogation is over.
Thank you.
Um, thank you for having me on the podcast.
Thanks, Jack. And with that, we will release our listeners to the 100th episode. So thanks for listening. If you like the podcast, do share us. If you're not sure about the podcast or think we could do better, then get in touch with me, because I do enjoy hearing from people, and it really does help us sharpen up both the format, the questions, and it's always great to get suggestions on guests as well. So with that, enjoy our 100th episode.
Like any organisation, it's getting everyone to consider carbon in their decision making across the organisation. It's a learning angle to it, and we're giving carbon literacy training across the organisation. But it's also getting on and delivering the change. So more than 3/4 of our vehicles are now hybrid or fully electric. We're swapping tens of thousands of our network lights over to LEDs. We're getting more energy efficient in our depots. So there is a kind of how we transform our own assets and fleet and reduce our emissions.
Welcome back to the Decarb Connect podcast. And today we're looking at a different part of the ecosystem around industrial decarbonisation, in that we're coming to a buyer of critical materials in the form of national highways here in the UK. And I'm joined by Malcolm Dare, who's Executive Director of Commercial and Procurement there, and Steve Elderkin, who's Director of Environmental Sustainability. And we're going to have a talk about the work they are doing to negotiate, to work, to contract with suppliers who can help reduce the CO2 ticket, if you like, around our national infrastructure. So, Malcolm, I'm going to come to you first with my standard intro question, which is, can you just give us a feel for how you've arrived at this point in time where you're working both for national highways, but also specifically on this piece of work around more sustainable roads and highways here?
So, from a highways perspective, we leave a legacy for the country. We build roads, we maintain roads, etc., and we leave a legacy. And a road is designed to last 60, 100 plus years. And when you're leaving a legacy for both the country and the communities that use the roads, you've got to do the right thing looking forward. And looking forward is, anyone that thinks decarbonisation is not an option is probably not really listening to what's going on or seeing what's going on. And so what we're trying to do as the client organisation is push the boundaries as much as we can, because we will not invest in R&D ourselves, but we can catalyse other organisations that manufacture the products that we use to invest in decarbonisation. And what we can do as an organisation is catalyse those markets, so we help to move the economy on, or the construction industry on, in that dimension. Personally, from my perspective, I like every industry I've worked in. I like seeing tangible things and leaving a tangible legacy. In the sense of helping an industry evolve and move on is something that really appeals to me. So that's where I am, and that's where we are as a business. And Steve will talk in far more detail than I would on this, but it's fundamentally how do we move the business and how do we move the sector on in the carbon agenda.
And just a quick background to you. So coming into National Highways, have you come from a construction background, a government background?
None of the above. So before National Highways, I'd always worked in manufacturing businesses. I started off running manufacturing operations in factories. Then I moved into the supply chain procurement, commercial procurement equivalent. I've done everything from fast-moving consumer goods. I've done capital equipment. I've run the supply chain for nuclear submarines, and before coming here, I worked for Thales, being the chief procurement officer for Thales in the UK and some of the smaller European countries. So the infrastructure, the civil world, this is the first time I've worked in that industry. I've always worked in manufacturing industries, which is very different, but the principles are very, very similar.
But you understand, I guess, some of the issues that then your suppliers are dealing with, and we'll come to that a little later on. Thanks for that intro. So Steve, so your role is very specifically about environmental sustainability for National Highways. Again, same question to you. How have you arrived at this point in time?
Well, I think it's a typical story of a furniture maker becomes a cycle path builder, retrains as an environmental economist, works in the government economic service, including leading the analysis for the Climate Change Act. And then in 2015, I found myself landing in National Highways as the chief analyst. And a couple of years ago, this role was created. It was a more senior role than we'd had previously in National Highways on the environment. And having run one of our big projects, being the chief analyst, the chance to pull together the two threads, return to the environment, but in the highways context was a fantastic opportunity for me.
Oh, great. So in the pair of you on this episode, then we have someone who understands that the kind of manufacturing sphere at a range of scales, and we have someone who understands how government has come at this. And yeah, interesting. Okay, well, let me start with my first official question then. And this one's to Malcolm, first of all. If you could just set the scene for us. And what I mean by that is when people think about National Highways of the UK, and this has an international listener base, so you may want to give a little bit of background to what that really, what you're overseeing. I think what would be helpful is to understand what are the emissions associated with it and what the goals you have in place.
Yeah, so National Highways runs what's termed the Strategic Road Network in England, which is all the motorways and all the main A roads. And we build, maintain, operate the Strategic Road Network. We leave a legacy in the sense, I mean, roads last a very long time and we have to do the right thing. When you look at it from a carbon perspective, when we look at 100% of carbon in our environment or our sort of ecosystem, 1% comes from the business, 2% comes from the construction maintenance of the road, and 97% comes from road users. But as the road users decarbonise and you get more electric vehicles, the percentage of build maintaining carbon increases. So therefore we have to reduce. It's as simple as that. And we have to conform to legislation, and we have to be continually bringing the carbon levels down. So what we do as a client, we fundamentally catalyse change within the sector to steadily reduce carbon within the sector. And for instance, 12 months ago, we published roadmaps for asphalt, concrete and steel. And they've been developed in combination with National Highways, the relevant supply base and the relevant trade bodies, so people like the Mineral Products Association. And on asphalt, we believe up until about 2040, 2045, we believe we can reduce the carbon content of asphalt by 70%. So we can go to 30% of the 2020 baseline that we've been using. So it's significant. So what we're trying to do is a significant shift in mindset and significant shift in materials that we use, but we do it very much with the sector. This is not something we do in isolation. This is all about working collaboratively with the sector to understand where we're going, what our intent is, and therefore helping the sector ensure they've got the right products at the right time, and us providing the market. So as they develop the products, they're not developing something that will never be sold. They develop something knowing it's going to be used by us as a major client.
And certainly, our members talk a lot about the need to understand that there are buyers out there that are as committed to procuring, lower carbon intensity materials or decarbonised materials. It's as important to understand that as it is to understand for them the policy or the financing or the technology that underpins it. So it's really interesting to hear that you've done that piece of work on those three main materials groups.
And that's why we've done it. We set the roadmaps out in conjunction with the supply base in the sector, so people are very clear of the direction we're going in. And so as the products are coming on stream, they know that we're going to create the market. An example is warm mix asphalt. As soon as we flipped our default standard warm mix asphalt, the major players flipped their default standard to warm mix from hot mix asphalt. And that has a significant benefit from an environmental and carbon perspective. So they know, and they have to have confidence as a client. They understand the direction, and we will move on what we've committed to do. And that's essential if we're going to rely on people investing in R&D to develop the products that we will need for the future.
And Steve, with your environmental and sustainability hat on, when you look at the organisation and what you're buying and what you're doing, all organisations have this thing that there's a whole load of emissions that they're kind of quite excited about because they know what they're going to do. And then there's a set of emissions that everyone just really wishes would go away because they're not yet sure what they're going to do. And it's a grittier challenge. What's your sense of that for your organisation? And how have you navigated that so far?
So Malcolm's already mentioned that there's the operational emissions for us as an organisation, the construction and maintenance emissions, and then there's the road user emissions. And I think one of the big things that changes as you move up those sources is how much control and how much direct command and control we can have around the reduction activities that happen. We absolutely need to reduce our own operational emissions, show leadership, demonstrate that it's possible. And I think, like any organisation, it's getting everyone to consider carbon in their decision making across the organisation. It's a learning angle to it, and we're giving carbon literacy training across the organisation. But it's also getting on and delivering the change. So more than 3/4 of our vehicles are now hybrid or fully electric. We're swapping tens of thousands of our network lights over to LEDs. We're getting more energy efficient in our depots. So there is a kind of how we transform our own assets and fleet and reduce our emissions. For construction and maintenance emissions, it's absolutely working in collaborating with the supply chain, with the value chain. We cannot just say make it so and it will happen. There's a confidence that needs to be built that this is the direction we are going in, and that it's clear that to work with us, you need to come on this journey with us and invest and innovate. And carbon performance is going to be important for you as an organisation in terms of your profitability and the amount of work that you're going to win with us. And I think what's really heartening to see is with the help of Malcolm and Malcolm's team, we are giving a very stable direction to the sector. This is where we're going. It's going to be part of your performance and your profitability. We talked about material suppliers being clear that there's a market for their materials, and I think there's a couple of ways that we can support that. So one is to create incentives for lower carbon delivery, and then the main contractors will be looking for material suppliers that can help them reduce their emissions. Now, 2/3 or more than 2/3 of our construction emissions come embedded in the materials that we use. So this is hugely important. The second way is to say, actually, we're not willing to have the most carbon intensive production processes for materials used for our site and for our assets. And again, we're going to need to move in a way that is clearly signalled well ahead of time. But again, that will be a pull through for those suppliers that can produce lower carbon materials. And then the third area, I get road user emissions. Our role as an infrastructure provider is to make sure that the infrastructure is there to support the transition, the rapid transition to low emission vehicles, and not least making sure the charging infrastructure is sufficient in quantity and functionality.
We'll come back in a little while to more of that discussion about how you work with materials producers, but let me just check in with Malcolm on something. So in your role in leading commercial and procurement activities, obviously that must be a multi-billion-pound budget. A big piece of this whole discussion, and I guess how you're applying that budget, is around supply chain transformation. I'm interested to understand a little bit about, how you've approached that, whether it's the data you needed originally or engagement with the supply chain. How has that piece of this worked?
Yeah, I mean, to help with the scale, we spend about £4 billion a year, and all of that is taxpayers' money. We're funded by the government. We're an arm's length body, and we deliver our remit, which is building, maintaining, and operating the strategic road network. The approach to the supply base is very, very collaborative. If we chose to turn around and say this is what we want and walked away, well, surprise, surprise, nothing happens. We invest a lot of time working with helping, outside of the carbon piece, helping suppliers develop, helping them think about how they could be more effective, helping them think about how they could make more profit in a sustainable way, because the better they are, the better the products, the better the quality, the better the service we will get. And when it comes to the carbon dimension, if you take, say, asphalt and concrete, the bulk of what we buy comes from the likes of CRH, Holcim and Heidelberg. And they're very big international businesses. Now, big international businesses choose to invest a lot of money in R&D to maintain their competitive edge. And we've been out and visited all of their research labs in Europe and had conversations at senior levels around where are we going and what we're aspiring to, so that they can understand what we're wanting to do, and therefore it helps them decide where they invest their R&D money. The UK businesses bid internationally with their other compatriots for R&D funding, but if we can get consolidation of needs for types of concrete, which are then used across multiple countries, at the end of the day, we get a very good product. They understand the market, and they understand that we will create the pull, we will create the market for that type of product. We're always looking for a minimum of 3 sources of supply, so we don't get stuck with, a monopoly position. But we're very transparent, we're very clear. And the relationships we have now with those 3 companies, as an example, are very good. I regularly talk to the UK CEOs. Their technical teams are engaged with our technical teams and Steve's team. And so there's clarity, there's understanding. It's all about us being clear on our intent and being seen to carry through that intent. And if we do that, and we do that successfully, we will see the products that we need coming through when we need them. We will have trialled them on the roadmap to make sure they're satisfied. Now, none of that is revolutionary. That is what many other industries have done that I've worked in. So all we're doing is really adopting what's proven in other industries and applying it to the carbon challenge within the highway sector, which is relatively straightforward, but we've got to be consistent. And a point Steve made about that pull as well, the biggest recent tenders we've done have been on the Lower Thames Crossing. First time we've been out and tendered for carbon, because it's the right time to do it. And we've seen significant benefits, and we've seen significant reductions in against the sort of carbon baseline coming through, because the supply base realised that we're very serious about what we're doing. And none of it is too revolutionary. It's just good, solid, proven approaches and building that collaboration and integration that we need.
So it sounds like, from what you're saying, that a certain amount, obviously it's a body of work that you're having to do, so I'm not suggesting it's not hard work, it is, but it sounds like it's gone relatively smoothly in terms of communicating with the supply base and these first tenders that you've been going through. But then I'm sure there are also sides of this that are challenging. Perhaps it's the areas that are out of your control, like, are your suppliers, are the technologies they're using, whether it's green or blue hydrogen or carbon capture or any of those other things, are they scaling at a rate that you, the buyer of materials, will need, let alone them, the manufacturer of material? I'm wondering what your gut feel is on that. Are you feeling confident that you will be able to get the volume of materials you need, i.e., are those technologies scaling, in your opinion, in a way that gives you confidence about what you'll need in future?
Yeah, I think so, because if you take carbon capture, I was visiting one of the Heidelberg concrete plants, which is going to be the first one they do. They they convert to carbon capture, they're going to invest a significant amount of money in developing that capability and doing it. Now, the roadmaps would indicate we need carbon capture coming on stream around 2035. And everyone I talk to is of the view that, yeah, that's realistic, that's sensible, because the roadmaps have not been done in isolation, they've been done with the sector. And so assuming the technology plans are coming through, then I'm pretty comfortable. There will be many bumps in the road, I'm sure. There'll be many challenges. But I'm not finding anyone out there that's saying, oh, we're not playing ball, we don't want to do this, we don't see the benefit of it. Every business we talk to takes this extremely seriously. And everyone realises that we've got to do it together in a collaborative way. And if we do that, what we're creating is a benefit for UK PLC, not just the highway sector.
I just want to take this opportunity to thank our production partner and sponsor, Jano Media, for their support in delivering the Decarb Connect podcast. Over the last few years, they've helped us to facilitate great conversations that connect us with our audience, and their skills and expertise mean that we get to concentrate exclusively on generating the content, the conversations that engage, inform, and inspire. Okay, well, Steve, let me come back to you. You, I know, published a roadmap, a report on kind of those core materials that we've talked about, so concrete, steel, asphalt. What were the kind of key points that came out of that? I mean, we've already I guess I was about to ask you as well, whether you're confident about those flow of materials. We've sort of addressed that, but in terms of the report, what else came out of that you felt was significant for others to understand?
So just how big a part of our footprint materials are, and if you take steel, concrete, asphalt and aggregates, it's most of it. And then if you consider the rest of it is almost all transporting those materials or carefully placing them on our sites. And so the first thing we should be thinking about around materials is how do we use less of them? And so it's a kind of a meanness or a leanness with our use of materials. And so the quality agenda, durability, getting everything right first time so that you're not reworking it, all of those avoid the transport associated with the materials, all the production emissions, and that's your first best option to reduce emissions. I think once you're into the roadmap, there are already huge efforts and investments being made around research and development, and we've got our own low carbon innovation program. We can join up, and I'm part of the infrastructure client group's carbon group, and there you've got the infrastructure clients across utilities, across all of the other transport family. And I think it's been consistent across all of us in terms of what we're expecting for these materials, because while we're a big client, we're not huge compared to the volume of concrete that's produced in the entire country. But if we can combine our demand signal with that of HS2, Network Rail, the nuclear and power industry and environment agency, then that starts to become quite a significant part of that market. And if we're all saying that this is the investment that we need to get to meet our carbon targets and the direction we're going, then I think that can help give the confidence for the investments such as CCS and the bigger scale investments.
I know that you've been developing the contracting for carbon contract. I'm interested in how that agreement came together, but also what's the conversation like when you take that out for the first or second or third tender? What do you hear from your supply chain? What do you hear from the materials producers? So I've done a classic Alex by bundling two questions together there, but the kind of, I guess, yeah, it's the background to the actual contract itself, and then what that conversation is actually like.
Yeah, so we published our net zero plan 2 years ago, and it set out where we wanted to go, the end target of getting to net zero for construction and maintenance by 2040. And it talked about some of the milestones along the way, such as we want to remove diesel from our sites by 2030, and that means away from plant machinery and use in compounds. And really the contracting for carbon policy is making aligning our contracts with those commitments. And so it says to work with us, you need to be able to work consistent with the commitments that we made in our net zero plan. So have a plan for getting to no diesel compounds in 2030. And we're setting out a trajectory for the scale of reduction we would expect from construction, the level of the percentage reduction in emissions to build a scheme compared to 2020. And to make that real, I think you have to set a carbon target for a scheme and say, given what you're delivering, you only have this budget of carbon to spend, and you need to convince us that your design and the materials you plan to use will live within that budget. Just as we've been talking to our supply chain for years about designing to a financial budget, we now need to design to a carbon budget and demonstrate that we can live within it. So I think it's a hugely important part. You can't just issue a contract and hope you'll get the right outcome. So I think the engagement with the sector, the alignment around this is important for us. The health of the industry, for all of us to have jobs and investment in this vital national asset, is dependent on us moving in this direction and getting that kind of hearts and minds point across as two.
Malcolm, with your procurement brain and your experience of kind of interacting with suppliers on all kinds of kind of new types of tender, I guess, well, is there anything that surprised you in this, or anything that you've seen? I guess what I'm interested in, let me rephrase that. Sorry, Malcolm. So Malcolm, with your procurement head on, I'm interested in your sense, how have you seen the ecosystem around all of this respond? What's your sense of the ability, but also the willingness of contractors to react to it? Have there been any surprises? Like, how's that kind of the human behavior around it versus the technical reality of it? How's the human behavior been to you, and have people responded as you expected?
The first time we've tendered for carbon was Lower Thames, and it's the first big contract as to where we are in evolving our carbon thinking, and it's an ideal project to really push the boundaries because of its scale on something like carbon. And when you have a contractor bidding for work on either the two roads package or the tunnels package, they inevitably have chosen, and they've got their preferred suppliers there, what I would refer to as their tier 2 suppliers. So the major asphalt and concrete suppliers have been working with the Lower Thames bidders in producing successful bids, and that's how they understand the products, they understand what the art of the possible is. We were very pleasantly surprised at the scale of benefit we were getting in the Lower Thames tendering. But the other thing we added in there, we made very clear that any tender commitments would be written into the contract. So it wasn't a case of make a nice statement and you may not have to deliver it. In the contract, it's very clear. You make a statement and you are going to be expected to deliver it. Otherwise, there will be penalties if you don't deliver against it, like any contract would have. But it was highly successful. And I think my personal view, the reason it was highly successful, we invested a lot of time within the project explaining what we're trying to achieve, why we wanted to achieve it, and the background, the hearts and minds element to the bidders. And equally, they had paired with some highly professional players in the concrete aggregate asphalt space. And what I've found is all of the major players that we've talked to, none of them have come back and said we're not interested. The only area that I have a slight worry on is the heavy plant, because it's not as clear as, say, asphalt and concrete, but that area is moving as well, and that could be hydrogen, for instance, is something we're pushing. But the major players, the major global players that understand where the world is going, are looking for an element of leadership within the countries they trade. And so where we as a client are leaning in and being very clear, I think we're tapping into a lot of willingness. Now, it's easy to tender, or easier to tender versus actually seeing it physically transpire over the next 5, 10, 15 years. But at this stage, you'd have to say it's looking pretty good. and assuming everyone does what they're committing to, and the products come through the R&D pipelines, and we're very clear on our intent, and we draw and create the market, I'm pretty comfortable that so far the evidence will be saying we can help to move UK PLC forward by the nature of what we buy. As National Highways, we're the biggest single buyer of asphalt, so we can really lean into and lead the asphalt market in the UK. And we have conversations with supply base saying we don't want to use fresh blasted aggregate from quarries. We want to recycle as much as we can. And all of the major asphalt players are certainly up for those conversations. So the evidence to me is that people are leaning in quite heavily, because I think everyone understands the importance of the overall carbon agenda, and everyone's looking to see what they can do. And look at the investment, for instance, in carbon capture and storage. This is hundreds of millions of pounds of investment being made because businesses can see two things. A, they look at it's the right thing to do, and B, they look and say there is a market for it. Therefore, there's a very sound business reason to do it. So I'm pretty positive at the moment. I'm seeing the evidence that says, people are there. People are definitely up for the challenge.
And Steve, can I ask you a question more about the internal response to this kind of work, which is sometimes when we Decarb Connect talk to our client base, which is more normally, as you know, the industrials themselves, one of the kind of interesting areas is it's not that anyone has reported resistance internally to decarbonisation, but it's more that it's not always aligned with how someone's performance is measured, or where their bonuses might come from, or the kind of regular KPIs. And I'm wondering, is that something you have addressed yet? Is that a conversation? What's been your thought process around that?
So I think our environmental performance is nationally significant. Around a quarter of UK greenhouse gas emissions come from road vehicles. We own 30,000 hectares of unpaved land that is an important sanctuary for nature and a corridor for nature. And we have important impacts on our neighbours through local environmental pollution, such as noise and air pollution, and so on. So what we do matters on the environment, and I think people connect with that really easily. And it really helps having an executive leadership and a board that understand that our license to operate and invest in the strategic road network is dependent on leaning in and being credible on our contribution to improving the environment and leaving a good legacy for future generations. So I think we hear regularly from Nick Harris, and quite often a large part of what he talks about is the environment being core to what we do. We know that we will find it easier to get through planning for our schemes if we've got a strong environmental story. And indeed, our performance specification, which is our kind of, as a quasi-regulated body, we're given funding, we're told what people want us to build, but we're also told what performance they want. And part of that performance specification is environmental performance. And so it is actually part of people's bonus that we deliver against this agenda.
Okay, well, coming to my wrap-up question then, I mean, whether it's a project that's the next thing that needs tackling with this in mind, or the next challenge in this kind of area, what do you see as the next gritty step in carbon management for National Highways? And Malcolm, I'll come to you first on that. Is it a project that's coming down the path towards you, or is it something else that comes to mind when I ask that?
No, I think from a supply base perspective, I think the challenge is pulling the technological solutions through. If you take asphalt, if we could recycle more and more asphalt rather than have to use fresh aggregate, significant benefits, but that's not going to get us there on its own. Carbon capture is going to be really, really important in the concrete space, but then it's important to many industries in the UK. So I think the real challenge from my perspective is ensuring that there is the pipeline of technological products coming through, or technology coming through, that enable what we're trying to achieve, as well as really doing the basics to high standard, in the sense of we don't waste, we minimize the use, etc., etc. But we can go so far with sort of focusing on the basics and getting that right, but this is going to require different technologies like carbon capture. That's the challenge, because you never know sometimes with some of these technologies. Sometimes you get things going bump in the night. But providing as a client organisation, we're being very clear what we're trying to achieve, and people know that we will create the market because of our buying power, then I think we'll be able to work through the challenges that come. We will rely on some technologies we don't even think about today in 20 or 30 years' time, without a shadow of a doubt. And so we've got to be flexible, but it's how do we create that pull in a solid longer term way.
And Steve, how about for you? What, again, that same question, what is it that's next on the hit list that kind of feels like a substantial challenge to you to get your hands on?
So I think that Low Thames Crossing has led the way in a number of areas, and we've tested things. It's generalising that across our portfolio, but we have really matured into our client role. For me, what sticks out is, I guess, how do we make the best use of this national treasure, which is the strategic road network? How do we use it as productively as possible, and therefore avoid the need for lots of new lane capacity construction? It's not that there won't then still be an awful lot of construction to do. We've got an aging asset that needs renewal and maintenance, but I would like to see us really stretch ourselves to limit the amount of new enhancement that we need to do to meet our purpose, which is to connect the country.
Well, both of you, thank you, Malcolm, thank you, Steve. Most of the time on our podcast, we have either industrials or technology companies, sometimes investors or policy, but I really have enjoyed having a true buyer of these kind of green or lower carbon materials, because everything we hear from the industrials is there's so far they can go, but ultimately if the buyers aren't going to step up, and if the buyers aren't going to present demand, and the buyers aren't going to show their kind of positive intent, it's really hard for them to kind of make the investments that are needed. So I think this was great, a useful counterpoint for the podcast, and really interesting to hear from you both. Thank you very much.
At Jano Media, we recognise that great content has the power to create impactful and positive change for lives and society. Whether that's video, live streams, photography or podcasts, partnering with us will enable you to harness the power of content to engage, inform and inspire. Reach out to us today.